Hi, this is Dr. Rod Story with Mere Medicine. Glad to be back in the Cross Politics studio today. We're going to talk about medical education. I suppose that some of you are wondering, should I be sending my little Johnny to medical school? That's a great question. After last visit with, well, what do you know, Johnny Peterson and nurse and the questions of the challenges that he faced, perhaps you're wondering if medicine is something that should be shunned altogether. And so we're going to have a conversation about medical education. I have in the studio with me a guest. Welcome, Dr. Miller.
Thanks for having me.
This is Dr. Chris Miller. Dr. Chris and I have known each other for, almost 10 years, I would suspect. He has just finished medical school. Where'd you go, sir?
University of Washington.
And tell me about that school. What does it look like?
It's a little bit unusual in the sense that they have a lot of regional campuses. So the University of Washington itself is the main area, but I was within the Idaho cohort. And so there were 40 of us going through, and yeah, that's about it.
It's kind of a cool medical school. It's the one I also went to. So shout out to my alma mater. I graduated 20 years ago today. It's pretty wild to think about medical education and how much has changed in 20 years. So you just finished, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. But first off, tell me about you.
Well, so just finished medical school. I'm going to go into general surgery as a specialty.
Okay.
So I'm starting residency in Iowa this July. My wife and I have been married now for 8 years almost exactly, and we have 3 kids and one on the way.
Awesome. That's quite a passel to take with you. I'm glad that you'll be doing that. I went through medical school with 3 going on 4. And so you and I have shared notes several times as to even is that a little bit of crazy on top of the crazy of going to medical school.
Go big or go home.
No doubt, no doubt. Well, God has been kind to add some more members to our family, and I suspect to your family as well. So you're thinking about general surgery, and obviously got into a residency. Are you glad for your education there at the University of Washington?
Yes, I really am. You know, any problems aside, I think they prepped me well for the residency itself. It gave me all the background I needed to do it. And then they also prepared me well for all the rotations that I went into during medical school.
And I'm thankful. University of Washington, back in the day when I was there, was ranked in the top 5 in the nation for medical education. I keep hearing that that's still the case. Why do you think that is? What's unique about the University of Washington?
There's a few things. I think probably the main thing is just that they've been around for a long time, or well established, and so they're very well practiced at what they're doing. Just they've had a lot of time to refine what they've been up to, and so I think those refinements have built up over time. And they really do have a passion for doing rural medicine as well, so they prepare physicians well for that, and that's part of their selling point.
Well, and they're the only medical school, or they were for much of the last 20 years, the only medical school in the entire Northwest. That's Washington, Alaska, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And that's where you actually have opportunities to do rotations. What are some of the memorable ones that you did as you traveled around?
Well, for me, I mean, the 2 biggest ones would have been my OBGYN rotation, because that was when I got into the OR and realized I really enjoyed it. And then my general surgery
where was
rotation.
that at?
They were both in Wenatchee.
Okay,
and
fantastic.
getting to work there in a small hospital as the only med student with a large team of surgeons was just really fun to get a chance to see what their lives are like, and to see myself doing that and say, yeah, that's a good fit.
Well, and many people listening may not understand what it is to go to medical school. Why don't you tell me a little bit about what it was like for you before medical school, and then we'll talk about what the current curriculum looks like.
So before medical school, you just need to basically get the science curriculum you need. So I originally went to New St. Andrews College. I took a bit of a scenic route, but then I got a second bachelor's at the University of Idaho in microbiology to get all the science prerequisites I needed to be ready to get going when medical school actually started.
Second bachelor's. Well, I wasn't that smart. I only did one. But I'm glad that you have that background at New St. Andrews. Do you think that was valuable as you went to med school?
Absolutely. I would really commend it to anyone thinking about it.
Fantastic. We would encourage you to look into New St. Andrews here in Moscow, Idaho, where we also happen to be located. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the education. How about med school? What did med school look like for you?
So med school, generally the way it works is you do about 2 years of book learning. And so you start by kind of reviewing the basic sciences, and they teach you the basics of medicine, largely the terminology you use, a lot of the most common diseases. And then after you've done those 2 years of book learning, then you do rotations, which is where you do a month of general surgery, a month of internal medicine, that kind of thing. Kind of speed dating through all the different specialties, and hopefully figuring out what you like during that time.
I like that term, and definitely if you find one that you are going to settle on, like you did surgery, you might go back and do a little bit more in your 4th year as you go on to doing a residency. For me, family medicine was what I really enjoyed, but I really realized going through man, I like all of these. And perhaps that's why I'm the generalist and still love what I get to do. I enjoyed being all over the Northwest, and that was one of my favorite things about being in medical school, but it was also one of the challenges. And I think you actually have challenges that I didn't have 20 years ago. And that's really talking about some of the culture wars that have been going on, or the culture influences, and how that's beginning to impact medical school. Let me, before we jump into what your experience has been, let me just kind of highlight an article that I would encourage Mere Medicine listeners to look up and read. And this actually stirred the pot in 2019. It was published in the Wall Street Journal, and it was basically, the article was called "Take 2 Aspirin and Call Me by My Pronouns." It was basically written by Dr. Stanley Goldfarb, professor of medicine, and actually the dean of curriculum at his medical school, the University of Pennsylvania. And he wrote an article really raising a concern for the growing influence of this idea of public health and social justice being brought to bear on medical education. Let me read just a brief aspect. He basically said that there was this new, highly politicized medical education that was starting to really impact medicine, and actually he said it should worry all Americans. Basically, the traditional medical model is a scientific approach. It's a study of a lot of different angles on it. It's a rigorous classroom instruction. It's hours at the bedside of taking care of patients. And that model has been really in place since like the 1960s. But now social justice and social agendas seem to be taking over. Quoting this article, "The goal of today's educators is to produce legions of primary care physicians who engage in what is called population health." And really, it was this idea that physicians are doing much more than just practicing medicine. We have a responsibility to go out, impact society, steer conversations, and what he was basically pointing out is that there's all the way from conversations about racism to global warming. We're really beginning to impact the health, the educational process in medical school. So I'm curious. This is 2019. This guy caught a lot of flack as to the conversation about medical education. People are saying, "Oh, whatever, that's not that big of a deal," and they also was a lot of pushback saying how important they thought this was. You've just finished 4 years. 20 years ago, I just don't even see that I had this in my education. It was science, it was bedside clinicals. Do you think that has been a major portion of your education?
Yes. I mean, medical education, there is a job at the end of the day. They have to prepare doctors to actually practice well as physicians. They're aware of that, and I don't think I'm not ready to go. So it hasn't that the social justice stuff has steamrolled everything, but it definitely is eroding some of those things. And so a lot of this kind of stuff is included within the curriculum, and there's often a tendency to want more and more.
Well, and that is the first primary question, isn't it? Is there enough hours in the medical education that if you start adding some additional things, including conversations about racism or gender or other things that have really become a hot topic lately, what is it that you might push out? I mean, obviously, you can only compare to what you experienced. Do you feel like a significant part of your education was given to those topics?
I wouldn't say a terribly significant amount. But there was certainly some, and there was always more if you wanted it. So like some of my classmates may have decided to take electives that were essentially just teaching you woke things instead of doing other more useful electives that would have prepared you for clinicals.
Okay, what would those have been called? Like,
I don't know, advocacy to healthcare systems, which always includes woke topics. There were others that come to mind, and there were even pathways within. There are also certificates you can get on top of your degree to kind of say you got really good at something. So there was a global health certificate. There was an LGBTQ certificate you could also get. I don't know what it was, but I can't imagine it was great.
It probably had some sort of a rainbow in its emblem that maybe you could put on your shoulder.
And as you push things out, and the thing is, as one saying goes, how much sand can you put in the sugar bowl before it isn't sugar anymore? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but certainly sand isn't great. And so
no,
you just don't
at least it's going to
much.
leave a bit of grit in your mouth, and it's not going to turn to pearls anytime soon.
Yes.
it seemed to me when you and I were comparing notes, and you were in your first 18 months of the more classroom book work, that there was mandatory aspects that you couldn't skip.
Yes. I would say the primary way it came to us was during, we would have blocks where like this week we'd be studying the nervous system, this month. And then we would have weeks interspersed throughout our more medical curriculum. And at the time, it was called Ecology of Health and Medicine, and some of us used to jokingly refer to it as woke week.
Okay,
where you just have
Ecology
a few weeks through
of Health and Medicine. That's quite a term.
Yep.
And what were some of the topics that they covered in those things?
Some of them were genuinely useful. Things like, let's talk a little bit about health insurance. Let's talk a little bit about how to take care of people in rural settings. Some of them, though, were things like racism within healthcare. Let's talk about white privilege. Let's talk about how to talk to transgender patients. The kind of topics you would expect, really. I wouldn't say anything terribly surprising. So they were mixed. Some of it was better. Some of it was worse.
Did you ever feel like it was just useless information, or even like, man, I could be doing something better right now?
Absolutely. I mean, in the sense that you could always be doing something better. The one place where it is useful is I think it did give me a good set of handles to understand what they were thinking. And I think that's helped me going forwards to just kind of be able to see what's going on culturally. But that's learning at the feet of your enemies, so to speak.
Well, and as Christians, we're definitely steeped in culture, and there's no way to escape it now. And the practice of medicine is certainly not without so many things bombarding the conversation in the privacy of the physician's room with the patient. Were these woke weeks optional? Like, could you have said thanks but no thanks?
No, they were. You had to do them.
Okay, so. Like how? Was there some arm twisting or?
It's funny. I guess basically they were required attendance. I don't know how they took attendance because I never tried to skip out on classes generally anyway. And for myself, I definitely used it as an opportunity to figure out, okay, how do I stick my oar in the water as a Christian, which was useful in its own right. You
Great.
Want to learn early on how to engage in a system that's hostile to your beliefs. But I know some people try to skip out on some elements, but
Yeah, I think you have some of the same level of nerd that I do, Dr. Miller. I never was one to skip classes, and I think you probably beat me in that even.
Yeah, I don't really understand the people who did. This is all fun stuff.
Well, especially when you're paying $150,000 for medical school.
And it's interesting. I mean, in the same way that if you see a train wreck on Facebook, you can't help but watch. I mean, there was some of that going on too. So
interesting.
It was interesting, even if it was bad in many cases.
University of Washington being a school with a lot of different campuses, how was it being an Idaho campus versus what did you see in the Seattle campus?
I can only report based on hearsay. Yeah. Being within the Idaho campus, we all knew each other because there were only 40 students, and I think some of the things were somewhat softened just knowing that we were all conservative. Many of us were a conservative group of people, especially, like, say, a lot of Mormons. But I have heard that Seattle is a much more hostile environment. And the kind of things, and the woke students will police each other. One particular instance of something I heard about, something that would never have happened in Idaho, was a student. There was an intramural debate basically going on because some students said that saying trans people of color erases the experience of black people because those are the people who are disproportionately affected by anti-trans violence. So they had this pretty ugly fight over whether we should call it that or the other thing. That sort of thing never happened in Idaho, but it definitely happened there. Yeah, so it's a
absolutely. And how about into the third and fourth year as you had to take care of patients? Was there a encouragement or requirement for you to participate in, like, abortion?
No. In fact, I would say I was actually pleasantly surprised by how willing people were to work with me. In many cases, there were several cases where I had to say, hey, like, I'm a Christian. I don't want to help put in an IUD. I don't want to, like, somebody tell me about euthanasia. And I tried to pull her aside. I was like, hey, by the way, just so you know, I'm a Christian. Like, and they were always understanding and never forced me to do anything.
Sure.
So at least at this point, that's the current setup.
How about transgender language? It seems to be a requirement now that you have to use certain verbiages or pronouns. Was that required as part of your care?
No, I think the only time there was something that was required was the medical school sent a letter on my behalf during my residency application, and they did automatically include my pronouns. Water under the bridge. Okay. But other than that, I think I was always allowed to essentially do what I want.
I noticed.
Go ahead. It's worth saying too, during those third and fourth years of medical education, the wokeness did get toned down in a certain respect, just because at this point we really were focused on real patient care of individuals actually in front of us. And then, of course, each location you get to has a different political flavor.
Sure. I can imagine if you're talking about global warming and its impact on patient health, when you're really in Pobunk, Idaho, taking care of somebody, that's probably not the conversation you're having. You're really talking about the patient's needs right in front of you and your care for them.
Yes.
I'm not expecting a positive answer, but did you ever feel like there were opportunities for conversations about these woke topics, either from you and your teachers or offerings of alternate conversations? Did you did they ever bring in the Christian and peg him with a bunch of questions?
I would say there was never anything official, but there were lots of, in my environment at least, there were lots of informal opportunities. So
Okay.
I could disagree in class publicly. And I even had one faculty member thank me at one point for doing that, saying that they thought it was helpful to get another viewpoint in the classroom. And I was able to have informal conversations with the people afterwards, asking specific questions about moral topics. So again, you were allowed to go there, but you had to be okay with being that guy, so to speak.
Okay. And I have a feeling you were okay with being that guy.
And it's a yes or no, right? You've been there before. You know how it is. Sometimes you say, "Oh, I wish I'd stuck my oar in the water," and sometimes you think, "Oh, actually, that was probably not my best move ever." And you just pray that God will bless the efforts and do what you can when you can.
Oh, Chris, knowing that I've had a couple of other men that I've seen go into medical school ahead of you, and knowing the challenges, I was praying for you often because it requires a great amount of wisdom in knowing when to talk and when not to talk. Is this one of those moments where you've got to be the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego standing all by yourself, or is this more of a wise as a serpent, meek as a lamb kind of opportunity where you're realizing, this is not my hill to die on, or God is at work and I don't have to be the arbiter of all justice here. I'm thankful that you found that. I'm really interested to keep following your story as you go to general surgery in Iowa.
Yeah, I've lived in Illinois, Iowa, and Idaho, and yes, that does confuse people.
You are hitting all of the I states, and you'll have license plates from each one of them. It'll be great. Talk to me about conversations just one-on-one with some of your fellow medical students. Did you ever feel like you were able to have fruitful conversations about these things, the woke stuff that seems to be pushing its way into medical education?
Occasionally. I certainly had some good conversations with people who were more inclined to agree with me as we would talk after class and say, "What'd you make of this? What'd you think on this count?" We had moderate students who would sometimes, I had a moderate student or two thank me at one point also for saying something. So there were opportunities. I probably, having kids and having a wife, I didn't make lots of super close relationships in medical school.
Yeah.
So they were often surface level with people I didn't know super well, but they were there.
You watch the Ben Shapiro's or the Doug Wilsons of the world going to university campuses, and they're universally shutted down. And it just is, it doesn't seem to be an opportunity for people to have a fruitful conversation. But I do find, like you, that in the quiet of the one-on-one, as you're just living life alongside other people, not necessarily brothers or sisters in Christ, but just coworkers and other students, those conversations can be really a natural segue. And I think as Christians, it's an encouragement that we should be salt and light in this world. And part of that is being willing to talk about these things and being willing to be a bit of a stinky sock in our current culture as we deal with those things.
And I think it's important too to remember, sometimes we think that the reason we do that is to fight the evil directly, as if the most important reason to speak up is to attack the bad thing that's happening. But I think in many cases, what's the most important thing is actually the encouragement you're giving to the people who agree with you. Oh, good, I'm not alone. As well as just reminding people who are sort of on the fence, hey, we still exist and we have things to say. I think the least important people in those moments are actually the people who disagree with you, because it's not like you're going to affect what they're thinking, but it's the other people who I think can be blessed by that.
And I think people are going to medical school not necessarily with the background that you were fortunate to have, where you understood that there is confrontation, there are worldviews that are colliding with each other, and that there are right ways to debate these things. And ways of blessing your neighbor by doing so.
And I would say I myself was blessed multiple times by other classmates doing the same thing.
Can you share with me one of those experiences?
Let me see. I know I guess I'm trying to think of a good example. I guess I don't want to be too specific because I don't necessarily want to blow anyone's cover inappropriately. But there were opportunities where somebody would say something and a classmate might raise their hand and disagree with something being said. One time somebody gasped when they said something. It was a great comment, and yeah, that is a real blessing. And there were other times when people would send emails out that were also a blessing to me. So there really is there's more opportunity there than you would think.
So we've already touched a little bit on, is the woke education pushing out the good stuff of medicine? Are we getting a little too much sand in the sugar shaker? But let's maybe ask a bigger question. Is this going to take medicine, particularly medical education, a way that is going to be ultimately into the ditch?
Yes, and something about the article that I would shift slightly is, thus far we've talked about it mostly in terms of opportunity cost of the education happening in the moment in medical school, i.e., if you'd say the medical student is an arrow in the hand, we're saying, the quality of the arrows has gone down, is the argument. And that may be true, although my experience, again, medical education still seems to be pretty good. I still feel like I'm prepared.
It's pretty rigorous.
Yeah. But what it is happening by teaching us all these things is they are teaching us what to focus on, right? They're saying what is really important. And that impacts what you decide to do later. To give you an example of the kind of thing that I think can come up, I know one of our professors at one point was talking about how this person had begun always introducing themselves to patients, including their pronouns. And this person kind of passed it off, the office story with a laugh. She was kind of saying, well, there was this time when, I said my pronouns and the patient kind of cocks their head like the Cocker Spaniel look. And she was like, I get that a lot. And she kind of passed off like a joke. But there's a sense in which what this means is that she was injuring her therapeutic privilege every time, right? And sorry, I think therapeutic privilege is the wrong word. I mean the therapeutic relationship, right? She is offending people consistently. And that's and she's doing it because we tend to think in terms of the system, like we need to do the right systemic things, and we care less about the individual patient in front of us. So I'm less worried about what's happening to the arrow and more worried about the direction in which we're shooting the arrows. I do think we are trained to focus on things that are less important, and I think that's the more important opportunity cost over an entire career.
There's a couple of things that come to mind as I hear you say that, Chris. One of them that I think is the challenge is that we are tending to try and de-emphasize race in the consideration of patient care at the same time as emphasizing race. So it's this weird dichotomy. And when I went through medical school, we were taught that there are significant and predictable differences in our physiology between different races, things that make us care better for the patient when we know what their ethnic heritage is. And I can't help but wonder, it's becoming a faux pas almost to talk as a physician and say, what is your racial heritage? It's like, can't believe you asked that, in a really kind of bizarre way, when it really is actually very helpful to know about someone's care. I'll give you an example, and I hope you were taught this, blood pressure differences in the treatment between African Americans and Caucasian Americans. It's very different. We tend to use a whole different variety of meds because the chemistry is often very different. And I would actually treat someone who is of African heritage badly if I treated them like a one-size-fits-all approach, like it was truly a raceless world that we live in. Did you ever come across things like that where they emphasize?
The answer is essentially yes, but usually in a debunking sense. And that actually came up specifically with the blood pressure medications. And we were taught that most of the differences actually aren't real or aren't good proxies for how to treat people in a way that's effective, i.e. you really should generally treat people the same way. And as for myself, coming out as a medical student, that's believable, right? If somebody says race is actually a bad proxy for knowing something about someone's chemistry or knowing what kind of diseases they're susceptible to, it's certainly possible that race may be a bad proxy for some of these things, but it's very hard to trust people who are very committed to saying race is not a good proxy for some of these things.
Well, so especially when they're
leaves someone like myself not knowing what to think.
And when they're taking it one step further, and I just read something in the American Medical Association that they're now suggesting that there's no medical reason to indicate someone's birth sex, meaning male or female, on their birth certificate, that it's not essential to our eventual treatment of them. And that again is just mind blowing to me. So when you start with, and that's undeniable the number of differences between men and women that start in infancy and go through puberty and all the way into adulthood. But it's an agenda or a perspective that is trying to trump those differences. When you see that in medicine and you go, well, the American Medical Association doesn't even know what men or women are, or that there are essential differences, it does make you wonder, are they really glossing over a lot of differences? And I would agree with you, because one of the challenges is also those assumptions. So if I look at a African American brother who comes in and wants care in my clinic, and I may be focusing in some directions or making some assumptions that I would be missing out on if I were to use that as the complete rubber stamp rather than thinking about this person as an individual.
I mean, to use an analogy, Christians are having the same problem with COVID, right? We're worried about the COVID vaccine. And the question is, do you trust the people looking for side effects? And the answer for most people is no, for obvious reasons. And I think I guess I would just say, people practicing medicine have the same problem, right? We really do rely on their science. We really do rely on their academic work, but it is becoming harder to trust them on some of these counts.
And I think wisely so. So do you think medicine is trustworthy?
Well,
that's a blunt question.
That's a loaded question. I mean, the best answer is partially, right?
Sometimes I just dug a hole, and I'm hoping to not make you fall into it.
Yeah, but no, I mean, that's the answer. Sometimes it is trustworthy and sometimes it isn't. And when people distrust medicine generally, I mean, I think all of us in medicine have to understand that that's pretty reasonable. We've done many things within medicine to make ourselves untrustworthy, and we have to deal with the consequences.
And I would say there's a healthy level, just in general, of skepticism that is supposed to be innate to our scientific inquest. We're supposed to say, boy, that study came out, and it sure doesn't seem like it makes sense. That either means I need to look at it again, let's look at it another way, let's repeat it, or maybe I really need to check my assumptions, check my bias, even consider a wholesale change in the way I approach it. I love that about medicine. Like when I was practicing hospital medicine, it was frequently that we would bring some ground-shaking change, that a subtle change would make huge differences for people's outcomes. We would change the way we do ventilator settings, or we change the way we give fluids when they're really in sepsis, or we'd really treat with antibiotics differently than we had spent most of the last 50 years approaching it, and with good thought, because an article, a scientific inquiry had brought a new understanding. And I'm thankful for that. I think you're probably in medicine for the same reason.
Yes, I mean, how can you not love that stuff? It's amazing how often people would, even in medical school, say, well, this is what we used to do, but that was really a bad idea. Now we do this because we studied it. And it should be, going back to a previous point in conversation, that is also one of the big opportunity costs within medicine at this point. Because we are focused on many of these woke principles and climate change and things like that, it does take academic energy away from things that matter more. And that's a problem.
Another area that I see some of that opportunity cost, but even more so, just a change in reflection, is a goal that says that the benefit of the many overcomes the individual. And I think that many of these woke principles, these societal justice ideas, really underemphasize what medicine is typically built on, which is doctor-patient relationship, one-on-one. This is really about a physician investing his time, skill, energy, and thoughts in the care of a person who's a singular soul, an individual right in front of you who has to take this decision or this information and then make a decision and either carry it forward or kind of blow you away. And that's the challenge, is I think COVID really brought out that force for much of us, is that we've begun to pivot towards this public health approach to medicine. This, it's okay if we have some individuals who just don't get great care, but as long as we get most everybody. And that is that drives, in many ways, very contrary to a medical approach that says, no, I'm going to very thoughtfully take care of this individual right in front of me.
And that goes back to what you were previously talking about, population health, right? Who are you actually focusing on? Again, the physician's being fired in the wrong direction. What's an important thing for you to do when you have a little downtime? Do you read a journal article, or do you agitate to try to get pronouns on your intake form, right? Because Because if you train physicians to focus more on these systemic level things and you say this is where real change happens, then that's what people are going to focus on.
Yeah.
And this also goes part and parcel too with, I think, just an industrial change within medicine, right? We used to work with smaller clinics, smaller hospitals, but now more and more of these organizations are death starring into these giant things.
You've used some potent terms there.
And those things, right,
industrial approach and Death Star, my friend.
Yes, I have.
You sure you want to keep going on this crazy career, Dr. Miller?
I'll stand on it. Yeah, let's go for it.
Excuse me. By the way, Dr. Story is fighting through a little bit of a chest cold. Guess what? We get sick when we take care of people. And so just getting over it, thankfully. Shouldn't pass it
Probably
on to
your
you.
fault.
I think
You
I'm
were
about a
probably
week and a
being
half.
inappropriate.
Well, you know, I do give my patients hugs, and what do you know? They share things. Okay, let me take this a little deeper. Would you encourage younger friends of yours to go into medical school? Would you encourage them to be doctors, knowing the 4 years that you went through, and now you're on the verge of another 4 years of 4 or 5?
5.
Oh, 5 years of residency. I did 3. He's a glutton for punishment.
Slacker.
Let's just play that there. I'm glad that the guy who's going to cut me someday is going to have 5 years of training. So good job.
Well, I'm sitting here going, 5 years? Boy, there's a lot I need to learn in that time. Let's better get started and get cracking fast.
Yeah. You start here pretty quickly.
No
So
pun
would you
intended.
encourage people who are in pre-med right now to go ahead and go to med school, particularly Christians who are wanting to walk faithfully?
At this point, I think the answer is still yes. I think there are areas within medicine where Christians can do really well and can really help patients individually and to a certain degree, hopefully affect the system. Hard to in this environment, of course, but you still can. So I would say at this point, yes, you should still be going into medicine. We do need you. It would be a great blessing to all of us. Having said that, you should also be realistic about exactly how it will go. Number one, you need to hold things loosely. You never know when you might have to put something on the altar when you're going to have to decide. For example, I don't mind saying I got the COVID vaccine. I didn't want it, but it was at least quasi required.
Yes.
Certainly it was becoming very hard not to. So I went ahead and got it. If somebody else's conscience had said no, then they would have to be willing to sacrifice that. So
Yes.
you just need to know something could happen. It could be taken away. I still feel that way at this point, right? And the other thing is that you have to also be realistic. There are certain areas within medicine where I think it would be very difficult for a Christian to function. I mean, a good example would be if you want, say you're like, wow, I just really want to be an OB and help women give birth. Well, at this point, a lot of the OBGYN curriculum that you'll be learning in residency involves birth control practices that do cause the death of an implanted baby. So So in that sense, you have to know you're limited. Christians, I think, are officially limited in medicine and may become more limited, and anything could happen at any time. You know something about that.
Yes, and we have a colleague who is working through internal medicine residency, and just by virtue of his location in one of the coastal cities, really has been hammered by a culture of LGBTQ that's built into everything that they do, the hospital system all the way down, and that's one of the challenges. So just not a qualified yes or an absolute yes. What do you say?
It's a qualified yes. And it's qualified because you have to decide if you're willing to take that risk, right? You just be realistic. Not everybody has to do those things, but if you do, we'll be grateful.
Well, and I will say, I don't think I had to think about those things 20 years ago. I feel like an old fogey when I say that. And as I've been mentoring medical students and others to go to medical school, it is a harder conversation about what is it you're going to face. And that's one of the reasons for this conversation today. How can these men and women prepare for medical school?
One thing is, and this will feel like shameless promotion, but it's just true. I think it really helps if you can get a great educational background. And for myself, New St. Andrews was great for that.
So what particularly?
Let's see. There are a lot of places I could take this, but one of the big ones is just when you work within academia, you're dealing with a powerful institution with a lot of knowledge, and it can feel like this invincible wild thing. So if you get a classical education and you've learned that fads come and go, intellectuals rise and fall, philosophies rise and fall, it gives you a perspective with which to just, I guess, see that none of these things are invincible, none of these things will endure. It's easier to not be basically dazzled by all the power they've accrued to themselves. So that's one thing. And another thing is it just, it means during your college years, rather than just surviving in an undergraduate environment where they're trying to dismantle your faith, you're actually going to be built up by your classmates. So by the time I was going to medical school, I'd had this really helpful vantage point given to me where I could look at things from that point of view. And I also had spent years during those formative college years of my life being challenged to be a better Christian by all of my classmates, so that by the time I was actually doing the pre-med and medical school stuff, I was just more ready for it. And I was a bit older, and that wasn't a bad thing either.
Well, I think your education gave you a leg up that I just didn't have, which is a liberal education in the classics, looking at these arguments that have been made about what is it that makes a human, how should a person behave, what are the aspects that are much higher than us, what is beauty, what is truth. Those are questions that most pre-med students never do, as they're just going through the biology courses and the chemistry and physics courses that I did when I went straight through. And I'm thankful. I think that was a wise move for you to finish that education and get that. I also think you were mentored by professors who loved the Lord and who modeled being able to engage in culture in a way that many Christians just don't get to see these days.
Yeah, it was a giant blessing that God gave me, and I would encourage people thinking about medicine to see if there's a way they can make that work. And the problem is when you're a young person, you get the idea like, right, I need to get married, I need to get life started, and wait, you want me to go to this undergraduate thing and then do more undergraduate stuff and then go to medical school? But it's really about, are you working well where God has placed you at this moment? Are you enjoying your work before the Lord? If you are, it doesn't matter if it takes forever.
How about medical school? How did you survive?
I thought medical school was easier than pre-med, honestly. I was allowed to focus on one thing, just get good at this one thing.
Sure.
And so, I got up early, I studied early, and usually by the time I got home, I was done, and I could spend time with the wife and kids. So, I mean, I'm not saying it was easy, but it wasn't as bad as many people make it out to be.
Well, and you're a smart guy, and you developed some good study habits. I watched you and your wife, Lizzie, walk this road through medical school together, and I do think that is a signature that I also experienced. My wife, Jenny, and I went to medical school knowing we were going to have to do this together, knowing in part that we were going to have to do medical school different than the usual brainiac who just eats, breathes, and sleeps medicine all the time and doesn't really have something beyond medical school. I also saw you everywhere you took a clinical rotation plug into a church. How was that?
That was great. I mean, it was just, I don't have anything brilliant to say there other than it's a real blessing to just see the Lord working in places and in people you've never met. You're like, hey, you're cool too. It was just a real blessing to both of us.
Well, and I think that was as hard as it is when you're moving to go visit someplace new, as hard as it is to get your 3 going on 4 kids tucked into Sunday clothes and out the door when you have been working a ton of hours. We need God's people, and we need to hear the word preached. And that's ultimately, I think, what we would encourage our brothers and sisters who are thinking about going to medical school to consider, is that you need to be deeply entrenched in God's word. It brings to mind a scripture that kind of comes, and I was thinking about this. It's out of Psalm 119. And in Psalm 119, David asked the question, how can a young man keep his way pure? We usually think about that in purity, like sexual purity. But I think it's a little bit deeper than that. How can you keep your way, meaning your behaviors, your use of your talents, the way that you spend your hours? How can you use your associations and your professional leanings? How can you keep that pure? How can you stay in a way that is God-fearing and God-honoring? You remember what the answer to that is?
No, I don't.
I'm going to put you on the spot. That's by living according.
Okay, yeah.
Yep,
Never mind. No, I don't think I was going to say quite that. I don't know what I was going to say.
That's okay. By living according to your word. It's really by being steeped in the word. Did you find a way to keep the word active in your life while you were in med school?
Yeah, I mean, basically, as you said, plugging into local churches. God blessed us in so many ways there. And then also, continuing to read the Bible individually and praying individually, and some as a couple, that it's basically, you just keep the same spiritual disciplines going within medical school, and you always have time to make that work.
And honestly, we have so much technology. I use the Bible reading app through my church that just brings up the next set of scriptures. When I hit the button, it pops up and it starts reading it for me, and I can be literally driving down the road or walking and hear it in my ear. I'm really without, I feel like, any excuse for having God's word active and regular in my life. And I know that you guys were active in doing that. Any other words of wisdom for people who are thinking about med school these days?
Trying to think if there's anything else. I think I already said the main things. Think about going to a place like New St. Andrews. Think about how you can get some great education going forward. Make sure you're actually willing to take those risks, and then just practice those things in the meantime. Learn how to speak out, learn how to love the Lord practically, because that all just pays dividends later.
And I had this, and I think it's been a marvelous relationship that you and I have had, Chris, in that I've had a chance to mentor you into this process. And I had mentors, men who had walked ahead of me, who had gone through med school, who'd done so faithfully with their families, who had worked through things that were hard and good, who had celebrated that with me. And we've gone out to dinner a couple of times as you've gone through these amazing times of getting into medical school and going away on rotations. And now we got to celebrate you becoming Dr. Miller. Hey, congratulations, and thanks so much for being with me today. Can I pray with you as we finish?
Please.
Father, thank you for the opportunity to be physicians. I thank you for the calling that is on our lives. But Father, we thank you that you first have called us to be your children, your sons and daughters. We're thankful that all of our works are really just nothing compared to the work that you do in our lives and through us. And Father, we ask that you would do that your Holy Spirit would be active, and we thank you through Jesus. Amen.
Amen. And then I think the other thing I'd just add too is anybody who wants to talk more about this, absolutely find mentors in your life, and feel free to talk to me. Dr. Story, you can always feel free to give people my info.
Well, and reach out to your local chapter of Christian Medical Association. That's what was active with me. I don't think as much active here in this area. Or find a Christian physician in your church who you can connect with, or reach out to us through Cross Politic. We're always here. Thanks so much. Appreciate you being on with Mere Medicine today. Thank you, Dr. Chris Miller.
Thank you. It's great being here.